Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and welcome to Brooklyn Savvy. We are here at Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, and I am pleased that Colvin Granum, the president of Bed-Stuy, is going to co-host Brooklyn Savvy with me today. But before we get started, I want to talk about what we're here to talk about, which is the Black tax, the cost of being Black in America. And this book was written by Sean Rochester. And I must say, Brooklyn, you need to read this book. It's extremely informative. I have to say, there were parts of it for me that were almost painful. But I think the information is important as we go through what we're going through in America today. Something that we've talked a lot about in Bed-Stuy, especially at our meetings at Bed-Stuy Restoration, is the wealth gap. What is it, when you talk about wealth gap and African Americans, what is it that is being conveyed by that?
Well, we frame it in terms of a racial wealth gap because there are disparities between African Americans and whites and between Latinos and whites in wealth and how much wealth they hold and control. And so at a macro level, for example, the median white family has net worth of about $110,000, while the comparable figure for African Americans is about $7,000.
Did you say 7,000?
7.
Oh, wow.
And for Latino households, about 9,000. A couple of policy institutes, Prosperity Now and another institute, I can't recall the name off the top of my head, have been doing some analytical projections, and they project that by the year 2053, African American families will have zero net worth, and the comparable figure for Latinos the comparable year for Latinos would be 2073, where they will have zero net wealth, while the net worth of white households will continue to rise. A lot of people think, well, this is all about education. And if we could get people to go to college, we'll close the racial wealth gap. But that's not true either. The data shows that college-educated households or a household headed by a college-educated person has about 1/3 less wealth than a white household headed by a high school dropout. Other interesting data points, and I'll just give you one or two more, is national homeownership, the homeownership rate. National homeownership rate for African Americans is lower today than it was in 1975. So on a macro level, these are the trends. The trends are not good, and it's not about education, and it's not just about how we behave, and that's why I love Sean's book, because he gets into the systemic issues and factors that have deprived African Americans of the means to create wealth and hold wealth. And what I like about the book, and for me it's liberating, because as I told Sean, it gets us past the slavery conversation.
Absolutely.
Where people say, well, slavery was 400 years ago, why are you guys still complaining, right? And Sean articulates not why we're complaining, but why we have a grievance.
And so, Sean, I want to segue to you. Now, your book is called The Black Tax. Talk to us what you mean when you say that, the cost of being Black in America.
So the Black tax is the financial cost of discrimination against Black people in America.
It's discrimination.
Of discrimination, right? It's anti-Black discrimination. So normally when we talk about discrimination, it's from the perspective of the morality of it. It's from the perspective of the injustice associated with it. I wanted to look at it from the perspective of what's the cost to it. Is there a cash flow effect, and does that flow through to a wealth effect, right? So I wanted to strip some of the emotion on it and just kind of talk about it from the perspective of just the facts. So when we get into a conversation about slavery, normally we talk about these things in qualitative terms.
Like it was bad, it was wrong, and
right? So in qualitative terms, we can always agree to disagree. I think it was a big deal. You don't think it was a big deal. It was that long ago. You don't think it was that long ago. There are implications to these things. Right. So if you think it's not that big a deal, the implication is that it was a small financial impact, right? If you lose like $5 and you work 50 million, not a big deal. If you lose 48 million, you work 50 million, it's a big deal. So let's look at what economists say that the value was associated with it, right? We don't want to, I didn't go back and kind of talk about slavery itself. I want to look at it from an economic perspective. So when you start doing that, you see that economists have made estimates that says the economic value of the labor extracted from millions of people over a quarter of a millennium, 250 years, was anywhere between 24 trillion and like 97 trillion.
Listen to that.
Trillion.
Right.
Right? So even if you assume the truth is somewhere in the middle, right, you're talking about upwards of $50 trillion. That's just a massive, hard to comprehend number. And while people may have trouble digesting that because of the newness associated with it, well, guess what? We can also price the value of the people enslaved in 1860. They were the largest asset, the most liquid asset in the country, right? They were traded on open exchanges. There was a price if you were old or young, male, female, able-bodied, or lame, right? So, and economists say that the value of those folks is so large that you have to measure it either in terms of national wealth or national income. So from a wealth standpoint, it's somewhere between 16 and 20% of US wealth, right? US wealth today is about $85 trillion. So we're talking about 14 to 17 trillion, or maybe about $15.5 trillion on average. If you look at it from an income perspective, they say that it's about 1 to 2 years of national income, otherwise known as GDP. Well, the equivalent today, GDP is about 19 trillion. 1 to 2 years is 19 to 38. If you take an average of that, you're at 28.5 trillion. So if you look at it from one mode, it's about 15.5. If you look at it from another mode, it's about 28.5. If you take an average between those two, you're at $22 trillion. So no matter how you look at it, you're talking about massive, hard to conceive numbers.
So you're talking about $22 trillion is what we lost.
Is what was extracted. The value of those 4 million black people in 1860 in today's equivalent dollars. That's what it's worth. Now, here's some food for thought. The 45 or so million black people today are worth 1.5 trillion, which means that we were worth 15 times more to the country as 4 million enslaved people versus 45 million free people.
Oh, well, of course, because we were free.
Right.
I'd like to talk about the impact that Jim Crow had, okay? And then I want to move on into that GI Bill, which is extremely current. But I want our viewers to understand that this is where racism gets embedded and it becomes systemic. So if you can talk to us about Jim Crow and what those laws meant in terms of us being able to pass down wealth, which is something that we haven't been able to do.
Right. So one of the things I want to do real quick, if you bear with me, I'll try to speed it up, is
that's all right.
What was the purpose of Jim Crow? See, we're taught things in silos as opposed to along a continuum, right? So you have emancipation, which is destroying $22 trillion of wealth for the white planter aristocracy. But we also have to remember that they're producing 61% of US export, that's raw cotton. We're dominating 80% of the world market. Cotton is like the equivalent of oil. There's 20 million people employed in that industry around the world. 1 million of those lose their jobs when that happened. So the whole world is in a global cotton famine, right? And they're like,
it's a collapse.
It's a collapse. Like, what is the US gonna do to put its newly free people back to work? And they need a massive, abundant, fully disenfranchised labor force. The solution to that global problem, right, is this thing that we know of as this Jim Crow society, which is really underpinned by this sharecropping context, right? And you remember, we leave emancipation with no assets, no resources,
no
right?
40 acres in a mule.
There's no 40 acres in a mule, right? So, so now what they do is they break those large plantations into small lots, and they have newly freed black families settle on those lots and agree to plant cash crops, right? And in exchange for doing that, you'll share in a portion of the crop. Doesn't sound bad on the surface, but the problem is that it's the white planter that sets all the terms and conditions of the contract. Those families don't have any economic resources. So they've got to lend you the money to buy food, clothes, shelter, tools, the fertilizer, the seed, everything from now to the end of the season, right? At rates north of 70% per annum. So they're setting your cost structure, right? And then when you actually take the crops to market, it's the white planter that tells you what they're worth. He's the market. So by definition,
You're
there's
gonna be exploited. That's what
100%, right? They set your revenues and they set your expenses, which means they define what your profit is. So if you're lucky, it'll be zero. And if you're unfortunate because they don't want you to go someone else who will be more lenient with you, they'll make it negative and roll it into the future. And now that's perpetual indentured servitude. And there's no ability to accumulate wealth under those conditions, right? And what a lot of people don't understand is we're not talking about a bad 3 or 5 year period. We're talking about a period that lasts 75 years where you're extracting massive amounts of wealth, right? And so the people in that situation are experiencing a 100% tax on their labor. It's another form of slavery, which is why they call it slavery by another name, right? So economically, it's devastating and it lasts for 75 years. The projections are you could estimate that they were able to extract another 15 trillion from the descendants of these newly freed people over that period of time, right? So when people are like, why don't we have more resources? There's a reason for it, right? There's a path here, right? In medical society, call it the pathology, right? The study of the path, which is what the book is about, right? It's about the study of that path to where we are. Then we can start talking about what we can do.
Just for a point of clarification, you mentioned that these large plantations were then broken up into smaller farms. Those were smaller farms, but they were still owned by a white landowner.
But yes, absolutely. 100% owned by the white landowner, and they just settled on it, and they just did all the work. Some of the terms and conditions were so draconian that if you fell ill, they had the right to outsource your labor to someone else and charge you back for it.
But that was just one piece of the discrimination. I mean, there were also vagrancy laws as well. Talk to us about what that was.
So
because we're looking at layers and layers of discrimination, not just one path.
Yeah.
It's like everywhere you turned, you were being stopped.
It is a diabolically efficient system that was designed, right? Because we can all sit here and be like, that's a bad deal. Like, I'm not gonna do it, right? Why would you voluntarily do that? So, and if you said, well, I'm not gonna do it, then they have these things, they have a solution for that. That's called vagrancy laws. And a vagrancy law says that if you're not gainfully employed and that you cannot prove that you are a landowner, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail, right?
And then put you to work.
And they did, right?
Is that where the chain gangs came from?
That's where all the chain gangs, right?
Oh gosh.
And then if you say, all right, I'll sign the contract, but you know what? I don't think I want to do it. Well, they have a law for that. Those are called contract enforcement laws. So you now broke that labor contract. So they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. And even if you decided you're just going to sit in jail and get 3-4 square meals a day and chill out, what they will do is something called convict leasing, which is they would lease you back out to the very white farmer that you didn't want to work for or to a private corporation. So there was no out. And that's the part
that's what I mean when I say it's hard to read sometimes because, we're coming up perhaps, in a different time, in a different context, but it's so important for us to understand this history because some of us are still burdened by it today. You wanted to say something,
just to say, as you're talking, it's slavery with another name.
Yes.
It's a continuation.
Absolutely.
And that's very interesting to think about.
And are we really in that much of a different context, right? Things have changed in terms of how things operate, just like they don't operate the same way they did during the period of enslavement. They changed during the period of Reconstruction, but you still had the same kind of fundamental agenda. And so that fundamental agenda is still here. And again, we're just changing, they're changing how they operate, and we need to change how we operate.
Fundamental agenda, what is it that you're speaking of?
The cost of being black.
Okay.
The tax on being black, right?
Talk to us now about the Homestead Act.
Okay. Now, I like to juxtapose the Homestead Act with 40 Acres and a Mule, right? So we all know we never got 40 Acres and a Mule, right? The Spike Lee joint, But I think it's interesting to look at what would that have been worth today. Because 40 Acres and a Mule, times 4 million slaves is 160 million acres. I mean, that's really hard to conceive in terms of the amount of land, right? And if you look at it from like a farmland perspective, the average cost of an acre is about $3,020 up to $6,350. So if you do quick math on that, on the high end, it's worth over $1 trillion, right? So that was not that was not provided to them, even though 50 trillion was extracted from them. But at the same time, actually about 3 years later, 3 years before 1862, I think, Congress passes the Homestead Act, which proceeds to distribute 246 million acres for 1.5 million white families, right? If you do the same math on the acreage, by the way, these are not Manhattan acreage. So if you do that, it's about 1.6 trillion. So that's the equivalent of about $1 million a family, right? So when we start talking about, bootstrapping, right, $1 million a hell of bootstraps. And the way it worked was you had the opportunity to be able to claim about up to 160 acres of land associated with it, right? And if you could claim it and you settled on it, stayed on it for 5 years, you could take possession of it. But here's the interesting thing. So if you were a European immigrant who came to this country with nothing but the shirt, on your back, you had the opportunity not only to potentially claim that, but at that time, you naturalized in 5 years. So you could have the $1 million equivalent of this land, the opportunity that it meant, and U.S. citizenship. But Black Americans whose ancestors had been here for hundreds of years were not allowed to participate in that, right? 99.7% of all of that went to white Americans. Now, researchers also say that up to, I think it's like 93 million white Americans are direct beneficiaries of that.
93 million?
So we didn't get that.
Yeah. So there are people like direct, not kind of, sort of, tertiary, direct beneficiary of it. It's a massive giveaway, right? Land was wealth. And it's important to see who received and who was denied after so much had been taken from them. And during that period of time, you had over 20 million European immigrants that came to this country during that time. It's important that people kind of have that context to engage in dialogue about where we are right now.
Right. And now moving even further into the New Deal and the Wagner Act. I mean, I'm giving Brooklyn a history lesson, but it's important so that we can understand the total context of what it is this is costing the Black community.
And the legal impact, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of times people are like, well, why aren't Black Americans further along, right?
And I get, right.
And so this is not just the history lesson, but the legal construct that existed to ensure that Black Americans didn't get further ahead.
Right, to ensure.
Yeah, it was intentional. This was not a byproduct of happenstance, right? So the New Deal was a response to the economic devastation of the Great Depression. So they wanted to do something to help the average American. And it was in this package called the New Deal, which was about $50 billion at the time, probably almost 600 million, 570, $600 million in today's equivalent, right? Economic stimulus into the general public. It was composed of 5 different things. It set the minimum wage. It set maximum work hours. It allowed labor unions to organize. It provides subsidies for farmers, and there's one other aspect of it that's escaping me. But less than 2% of all those economic resources went to Black Americans. Now, how did that wind up being the case? So for it to pass through Congress, which it had to pass through the Southern elected officials who were notoriously discriminatory and white supremacists, they required...
And they were Democrats.
At that time.
Yes.
At the time,
Right,
absolutely.
at that time, yeah.
They required 2 adjustments be made. The first was there had to be an exclusion of agricultural workers and domestic workers. And guess what Black people were doing for the most part at the time? 70% of all of our workforce was doing those things. So one fell swoop, you cancel those folks. The other thing that they required for passage was they wanted local administration of the funds. And when you hear local administration and state control and all those kind of things, that's the most effective way to discriminate, right?
Yes.
And those 2 adjustments had been made so that they could actually discriminate in the office. And that's how you wind up with such a tiny portion of Black Americans actually being able to participate from that. If you look at the subsidies that went to farms, right, owned by white Americans for the most part, you have Black tenant farmers and sharecroppers on it. They were paid to not plant stuff, just leave the land fallow, and they were supposed to distribute the funds through their workers, which they did not, right? And you had 500,000 Black farmers lose their jobs and occupations associated with that. Even the creation of the minimum wage at the time was a huge controversy, because you're talking about, even at low levels, having white men, primarily, and black men, primarily, earning the same wage, which was not acceptable. You had Congress people on record saying, you do not understand what you were talking about here. And that led to the exclusion of 100,000 black people from the payrolls associated with that. So you wind up having these really, economically
And we're paying
devastating.
taxes all along.
Absolutely.
And not get, and getting the short shrift complete. We're subsidizing the institutionalized racism. I think it's fair to say that's what this is.
Yeah, no, it was explicit and
Right.
well known and accepted. This was not a mystery by any stretch of the imagination.
And as we go through this history, the GI Bill.
Yeah, the GI Bill was just a phenomenal idea, quite frankly, right? You had the Second World War. You had 16 million American soldiers returning from fighting in Europe and in the East, and they were coming back. And they wanted to invest in college education for them, job training for them, as well as subsidizing housing. Just a wonderful thing for an extraordinary sacrifice. Of that 16 million amount of soldiers, about 1 million of those were black soldiers, right? And of the resources that were put into the GI Bill, it's about $95 billion at the time. It's close to $1 trillion if you put it kind of in today's dollars. Less than 2% of that went to actual black soldiers, right? So, and while you have universities in the North and the South expanding so that they can create enough seats for these incoming soldiers, you black soldiers cannot participate.
Right, because segregation laws,
because
right?
of segregation.
Right.
And then the HBCUs who are there are chronically underfunded with not enough infrastructure to handle the demand, right, for the resources. So you're talking about up to $45 billion that was actually, in today's equivalent, that was never distributed to black soldiers. And I'll give you just an anecdotal story. I like to keep it to the facts, but I had this, I was talking with an older gentleman who was one of the trustees at a church, and we were having this similar conversation. And he was just like, I remember this. My father was telling me about this because his father fought in World War II. He said he would be denied every time he went to the office, all the time. And he finally went to an office, and he had been denied, and he was leaving. One of the people said, what company did you say you were with? And he shared the name of the company. And it turned out that company had resulted in saving that gentleman's life, right? So he said, come on back, let's fill out the paperwork and make it happen. The point there was he had to be part of a company that actually saved this person's life to get the very benefit that he should have gotten by right and law and citizenship, right? I mean, it's a pretty remarkable bar to set, right?
And when I hear this, I feel that this is data for reparations, because this here makes me, it's very clear what has been extracted from the African American community. But another point that I'd like to make is oftentimes, and we live in a melting pot in a way in Brooklyn. By that I mean we have people from all kinds of backgrounds that are black come here. And what I hear at times is, why aren't black Americans doing better? And it really infuriates me. Do you know what we've gone through to get to where we are right now? And in your book, you talked about how, you talked about the bias, and I want you to speak about this, how you see this and how you've talked about it in your book.
Yeah, I think, so there's a lot in there. One of the things that I'm a big believer in is that we're stronger together.
Absolutely.
But I think it's tough for people to work together when they don't understand each other and they don't empathize with each other. And that's even within the African diaspora, right? Like, I'm from Barbados.
That's the word, diaspora.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm from Barbados, and I get it. Like, I know what the thought process is, right? And then I talk with our brothers and sisters who are coming from the continent. And the problem is that we all see each other through European eyes, right? This information is not present. So we don't really understand. This is the land of opportunity. Like, why aren't you just killing it and crushing it?
Right. Just crushing it, right?
But that's an observation that's being made 152 years later. See, no one said you cannot go to that university. No one said you can't start that business. Black people were literally murdered for pursuing the actual American dream, right? In public and announced.
Lynched.
Yeah, over 4,000, right? According to the records, I'm sure it's much, much more than that. So people often don't have that context. And when you're under that level of trauma, you will adjust, right? When you see people start businesses and they're dragged out and murdered in broad daylight, that sends a powerful sign, and no one comes in. They tried to pass anti-lynching laws 200 times.
Yep.
And didn't
Never
do it
passed.
till like a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Right? So there was no authority to turn to that was going to save you. So people would adjust and try to survive. I think that's an important thing that everyone needs to know and understand, right? The other piece is, it shows you the economic implication of these things. It's just not that it happened and that it was like a bad thing, right? It's that it had an economic impact and that it matters. It's temporal. Like those of us, the folks that we've met who like retire with security, and something had been done over the course of 40 years, right, for them to be in that position. Those decisions were made at that time by them or whomever led to them being in this position. The extraction of trillions of dollars and the denial of trillions more has led to Black Americans being in a position where we own about 2% of U.S. wealth.
And unfortunately, we're going to stop here because this is a two-part episode, Brooklyn. We're going to talk about ways that we can overcome this, and we're going to talk about some of the discrimination that exists today. So I just, I get emotional because I just think the work that you're doing, I think this book is a must-have. I just applaud you. Thank you so much, Colvin, for bringing this to the fore, and we'll be talking to you, of course, in the next episode as well. And to you, Savvy ladies, thank you so much. And we will see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.